It's
No pressure.
there's my. So, good morning, welcome. Today is October 15th, the Ides of October. Not nearly as interesting as the Ides of March, but it was on this date in 1520 that Henry VIII ordered bowling lanes at Whitehall. So they've been bowling there in the palace ever since. That was, in 1520, that was the English palace, whereas now it's Windsor Castle. Back then it was Whitehall. Kind of thing. In 1582, the Gregorian calendar was introduced, which added 10 days. So had it not been introduced, today would be October 5th. So just people who like calendars find that really important. So I just want to point that out. 1815, Napoleon went to St. Helena to begin his second exile. Normally I wouldn't say that, but apparently there's a big new Napoleon movie coming out soon. So just so you guys know that there it is. And in 1894, Alfred Dreyfus was arrested in France. Is anybody familiar with the Dreyfus affair? It was a movie, it was a book. Alfred Dreyfus was arrested, a French officer. He was Jewish. He was a French/Jewish officer who was arrested, and it turned out for treason and all, and he was sentenced to, humiliated, lost his rank, the whole 9 yards. And then it was determined that it was entirely based on the fact that he was Jewish, not because he had, his commanding officer, one of the commanding officers just didn't like Jews in command, and so they trounced up some charges. And so you had what's called the Dreyfus affair. And you can look it up, and there's been several movies. A famous author at the time, Émile Zola, who would have been like one of the best-known fiction writers in France at the time, kind of took up the cause. And one of the things about it is it became one of the first cause celebs kind of things, where the celebrities kind of get together and sort of say, hey, this is all wrong. He eventually was released, exonerated, and all. But again, it all started on this date in 1894. In 1906, evangelist Sam Jones died. Sam Jones was one of the great American evangelists, kind of a transitionary guy between like D.L. Moody and Billy Graham, or actually Billy Sunday. Better, because Billy Sunday kind of leads into Billy Graham sort of stuff. But he died on this date in 1906. In 1917, Mata Hari was executed. We all know Mata Hari, the spy, again, by France. So France not looking good today. Sorry about that. In 1932, Gladys Aylward left Liverpool for China. Does this name ring a bell to anyone? Gladys Aylward. Okay, so she left. She was told by the various mission boards that she shouldn't go. She went anyway, and was there for several years, running a mission, running an orphanage, and ultimately during, I think it was the Boxer Rebellion, or that might have been earlier, but one of the Chinese revolutions ended up saving 100, is credited with saving 100 orphans. And the book and movie, The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, has anybody seen or heard that film? It's an Ingrid Bergman movie, is based on her life. But it was on this date in 1932 that she left. 1951, I Love Lucy premiered. Has anybody seen I Love Lucy? It's hard to believe that show is 70 years old. Okay, 72 years old. But yeah, I Love Lucy premiered on this date. And a year later, Charlotte's Web was published. Has anybody read Charlotte's Web? That book has a really sad ending. I don't know if you ever really think about it.
The spider dies.
Everybody leaves. They all go out and party, and the spider is alone and dies. I'm like, what are we teaching our kids these days? I'm just, I just remember, I'd read it as a kid, and again, one of the things I did was I read to the boys all the time, and I remember reading Charlotte's Web, and I don't know why, and Debbie was making fun of me at the time because I was complaining about Charlotte's Web. It's like, this is a sad book. They all leave her, leave the poor spider alone, and she just dies, but I'm getting over it. The therapy, now it's just come back up. Speaking of things that might require therapy, it was on this date. How many remember the song "You Light Up My Life"? Okay, yes. It first hit #1 on this date in 1977, and stayed there for 10 weeks. It's like one of the not the longest. I don't know what the longest is, but that song stayed #1 in the U.S. for 10 weeks. Debbie Boone was the singer. She went on to sing. Had a very successful career as a Christian artist. I don't think she ever came close in the popular pop music universe. But yeah, it was on this date, 1977. And finally, I know some of you are thinking, is he ever going to stop? Today is P.G. Woothouse's birthday. He was born on this date in 1881. Does anybody know who P.G. Woodhouse is? Okay, you should. P.G. Woodhouse he's a British turned American writer. And he wrote a series of stories, several stories. He's a short story writer, and actually some novels too. His best known characters are Jeeves and Wooster. They're like Jeeves the butler, kind of. He's the one that created Jeeves and Wooster. And the Jeeves and Wooster stories were brought to the screen 20, 30 years ago, starring Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie. This was Hugh Laurie. Did anybody watch the show House, Dr. House? So Hugh Laurie is English. He's very English, although in House he's an American doctor. And but before he was doing that curmudgeonly, I hate everyone, he was the lovable nitwit Bertie Wooster. But it's his birthday. It's P.G. Woodhouse's birthday. It's not. It might be Hugh Laurie's birthday. I don't know. But it is P.G. Woodhouse's birthday today. All right, we are talking about 1 Corinthians. Today we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I'm sorry, Now remember, Paul spent some time in Corinth. He spent a year and a half there. He leaves Corinth. He's replaced by Apollos. Not exactly, things happen. The church kind of goes off the rails a little bit after Paul leaves. It's not 100% certain that it's not really Apollos' fault, but one of the assumptions that we discussed last week was pretty clear based on the text that Apollos was a better speaker than Paul. And one of the reasons why Paul is constantly referring to his poor choice of words or didn't come with eloquence and things like that, I think is because he's trying to draw this comparison between him and Apollos. And his problem is that there's been another leader in the church, another dynamic leader in the church after him, and now they're into another one, because 1 Corinthians 16, later at the conclusion of the book, makes it pretty clear that Apollos isn't in Corinth either. So he's moved on as well. So Paul is trying to regain authority or influence in this church that's gone through a couple of different leaders. It would sort of be if, most of you may not recognize the name, but the pastor before Pastor Don was Pastor Filgren. And it would be like if Pastor Filgren would be, I don't even know if he's still around or not, but if he were to suddenly reach out and say, listen, I've heard about what's going on there at First Baptist, and here's what you guys need to do. And how would we react to that? If you say, oh, well, the former pastor of the church says we need to do this. Like, really? He's the what? And so that's kind of what Paul is trying to do. And so last week, we talked about this Corinthian Gentile idea that they're trying to, rather than follow the words of Paul or the message of the gospel, that they're looking at this Greek idea of wisdom. And Paul says, this wisdom is foolishness. This human wisdom, Sophia is the Greek word, this human wisdom that you're following is foolishness in God's sight. And he goes on all the different ways that it's foolishness, and he says, but there is a wisdom from God. And God's wisdom comes in, and we talked about, we do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature. Okay, so again, the problem that Paul has with the Corinthian church, among other things, is that they have this idea, and I use the phrase realized eschatology, this idea that they've achieved it, they have reached it, we're there, we have made it. We are mature in Christ, and Paul is kind of saying, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're not nearly where you think you should be, and he really kind of doubles down on that idea this week. Okay, so he talks about the Spirit. Remember, we talked about the Spirit last week, and the Spirit has all of this great stuff. The Spirit searches all things, and we have the Spirit because we have the mind of Christ. All right? I know you're wondering, is he ever going to get to chapter 3? Yes, right here. Okay? He ends chapter 2. Paul ends chapter 2. He says, the Spirit does all of this stuff for us as believers. We have the Spirit, and we have the mind of Christ. Now, this is one of those situations where the chapter and verse divisions work against us. Now, the chapter and verse divisions are not inspired. Okay, so it's one of those things that's really convenient, and perhaps the convenience has been a detriment to us, because we tend to get to the end of the chapter and go, okay, I'm done, which is exactly what I did last week. Okay, and okay, we're going to start chapter 3. Now I'm looking at chapter 3, realizing, oh, wait a minute, chapter 3, the start of chapter 3 really just kind of adds the punch to the end of chapter 2. Okay, so again, so you kind of imagine that they're just kind of reading this through. And Paul, the first line here, brothers and sisters, chapter 3, verse 1, brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly. So Paul is, in chapter 2, he's going on, he's saying, you guys thought you were wise, but you're really foolish. That God's wisdom may seem foolish to the world. He said, but we, as believers, we have the Spirit. This is the Stand translation, by the way. We have the Spirit, and the Spirit shows us all of these things. We have this thing, and we can judge all things. We can be disciples in all different ways. We can do all kinds of great things because God has given us the Spirit. We can reach that level of maturity. And then in chapter 1, verse 1 there, he says, but you're still worldly, but you're not doing it. Okay, so chapter 1 kind of puts the punch, verse 1, 3:1 puts the punch to, the coup de grace, as it were, to his statement about being in the Spirit. It's like, but you're not there yet. Now, they clearly thought they were. The people in Corinth clearly thought they were, clearly thought they'd made it. Why else would, you don't walk up to a 1-year-old and have a conversation with the 1-year-old and explain to them why he or she can't drive a car. Okay, because it's not really an issue. You would only do that you would only have that kind of, or if you do, it's not a difficult conversation. Okay, it's a more difficult conversation when you're talking to a 17-year-old. Okay, they say, here's why you can't drive the car. Right, and so here he's having this difficult conversation. You guys can't drive the car. Okay, you guys haven't got it yet. You're not nearly as mature as you think you are. You have not reached the point that you think you've reached. Okay? And so Paul finishes chapter 2 by stating that we believers have the mind of Christ, but Paul states that the Corinthian believers are still worldly. So it's like, why are you acting the way you do? Okay, again, my sub-theme for Corinthians is, what is wrong with you people? I think that should be the text. That should be the, what is wrong with you people? Okay? But he says, I live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ. You guys think you've got it all figured out. You guys you've had an apostle. You've had Apollos. You've had all of these benefits. You should be way down, but you are still infants in Christ. You are nowhere near where you think. I don't know. I'm not saying that anyone in here has. Have you ever had one of those conversations where somebody really puts you in your place? Usually about once a day, Debbie sits me down. All right, it's time for that conversation again, kind of thing. But they really just sort of like, oh yeah, I thought I did it. Oh, okay, that's not, and we don't like those conversations, right? Anybody enjoy that? But most people don't enjoy You know, if you've ever worked for a boss who really enjoys those kind of conversations, I believe that's what they refer to as a toxic work environment. We have somebody that just really gets a kick out of that sort of thing. But Paul is like, hey, you guys are you're infants. You don't know nearly what you think you do. Okay? I gave you milk, not solid food, for you are not yet ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. Ooh, okay, Paul, don't hold back. Tell us what you really think. Okay? You are not ready. They had been given milk, introductory concepts, lessons, instructions. I know when I remember there was when I was a kid, our church had a couple of Bible, they may still be around, the milk and meat Bible studies. Does anybody remember those? I know you might show your age if you do. But hey, if you know Charlotte's Web, no, I'm just kidding. Those of you who remember I Love Lucy, no, I'm just kidding. But with milk and meat. And so the milk was, kind of, this is the Bible, this is why you should read the Bible, kind of stuff, introductory ideas, this is creation, this is the stories of Jesus kind of thing. And the meat, the meat would have been like some of the doctrinal ideas. What does it mean to be omniscient? What does it mean to be omnipotent kind of thing, okay? So, but whatever the Corinthians thought they had, whatever the Corinthians thought they had, it wasn't Paul's idea of being a mature Christian. Okay? I gave you milk. In fact, you are still worldly. Okay? You are still worldly. Indeed, you are still worldly, for since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? So the characteristics of being worldly include, but are not limited to, jealousy, quarreling, following divisions. Okay, again, these divisions, he comes back to them in this is something that keeps coming up over and over again throughout. There's this group that follow, and I think the two main groups are, there's a group that follows Paul and there's a group that follows, or maybe not follows isn't quite the right word, but they're fans of Paul. And they fondly remember the days of Paul. Oh, Paul used to do this. Paul used to do that. And then there was, but Apollos did this. Apollos did that. What would, they wearing the bracelets, what would Apollos do? What would Paul do? Kind of thing. Sort of stuff. And we've all kind of been in that situation whenever you're going through a transition. And it's just sort of interesting that we're in this transition that at some point there's going to be a new pastor, and we're all going to. It's just natural. We're all going to do that. Sit there and go, that's not how Pastor Don did it, and it might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. I don't know. It's something different. Every time you take a new job, you always hear about the previous person. Oh, this is how the previous person used to do this. So I'm sure Mark has heard a few things about how Stephen Leinard used to do things. Oh, Stephen used to do this. Stephen used to do that. And of course, I just say that because Stephen Leinard is coming here tonight, kind of stuff. And so, if he comes back with a big knot on his head, it's because Mark hit him with a stick in the back. From how many years I've heard that you did this, you did that, kind of stuff. And Stephen probably, who was before Stephen? John, well, who was before Stephen? Who was the music leader before Stephen? Was it
I forget his name. We had two that lasted just a year each.
Yeah, the one they fired. They fired one.
Yeah, we heard one. I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
Gordon was
No.
Anthony.
Anthony, yes. Anthony, I think, is the one they fired.
Yes.
But I'm sure Stephen heard, Anthony did this kind of stuff, sort of thing, But be that as it may, it's just, and so they're following Paul. He's like, look, you still have these divisions. This is not the point. This is not what the focus should be in the church. What, after all, verse 5, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned each his task. We just happened to be there. We just were the ones that introduced him. And then, of course, this is where, in the end, Paul and Apollos are only servants. And then Paul starts with an analogy about gardening. Okay, so I'm going to just step down here and let Debbie take over at this point, because I don't want to be held responsible for anything I say about gardening. But no, he says, as the Lord has assigned, I planted the seed, Apollos watered, but God has been making it grow. Okay, Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God has been making it grow. Okay, or the King James, the Lord God gave the increase. Okay, God gave the increase here. Okay, that's all. I had a role, Apollos had a role, we had a different role, different person, different approach. Okay, as the Lord. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. Okay, so really, it's like we should be unified around what God has done or what God is doing, instead of worrying about, well, this is how Apollos used to do it. That's not what Apollos told us. That's not what Paul told us. Kind of thing. Getting into this silly argument. But only God who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose. The planter and the water have one and hopefully the same purpose. Have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor. For we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. Okay, so Paul tells the believers in Corinth that they, plural, are God's field, God's building. Okay, now this is something, and I mentioned this when we first started started talking about Corinthians, that most of the instruction in Corinthians is to the church, is to the group. Okay, so it's important that we keep that straight. It's not, and if we take it and say, oh well, he's speaking to me. Well, no, he's speaking to a group, kind of thing. He's talking about the church, and so here we have some discussion of how Paul thinks the church should operate, the body. And when we look at this and go, oh, okay, yeah, this is my life. This is here, you know. And even if you think it applies, you're still taking it out of context. This is one of the problems of taking verses out of context, okay? And this is like my pet peeve of Bible hermeneutics. Ready? Here it comes. Okay, we assume wrongly that taking a verse out of context, everybody knows that's a bad thing, right? Everybody understands that's a bad thing, okay? But we assume wrongly that if you take a verse out of context, you will always come to a wrong conclusion. Okay, that's not the true. Okay, you can take a verse out of context and prove a good point. You see what I'm saying? So you can take a verse out of context and say, based on this verse, you should love your mother. That's a good thing, right? Now the verse may have nothing to do with loving your mother, but we go, oh, what happens is believers, you know, people think, oh, I never really saw it like that before. I never really saw that in the text before. Okay? And the reason you never saw that in the text before is because it's not in the text. Okay? So suppose we have two people. Say, you know, there's person A and there's person B. And I say about, both of them are rotten individuals. Okay? They're both, you know, they're both Republicans or they're both Democrats, depending on how you vote. Okay, so they're both, they're both rotten individuals. And I happen to say, you know, that is a rotten individual. And I'm pointing to person A and I go, that is a rotten individual. And you hear me say that about person A, that is a rotten individual. Okay, and then you are talking to someone else about person B. And you say, well, you know, like Stan said, that is a rotten individual. Okay, now, person B is a rotten individual, right? See what I'm saying? And I did say that is a rotten individual. Okay, so you've taken what I said out of context about person A to talk about person B, even though had I been asked about person B, perhaps I would have said that's a rotten individual. I don't know. But you see, that's taking that out of context, even though the point you're making is right. Is that clear? We do that. We do that all the time in the Bible, and it's, you know, and ask ask Debbie, what it's like sitting next to me in church when somebody does that. That's when the groaning starts, and the wiggling, and the elbowing. Not me elbowing, she's, stop it! Kind of thing. And then we go home, and she sits me down, and she says, listen, you're not as far advanced as you think you are. No, she puts me in my place. But we do that all the time. So again, we want to remember that Corinthians, most of the time, now there are a couple of exceptions, most of the time, Paul is talking to the group, okay? And he is right here. Okay, so here, beginning in verse 10, he's talking about the local church, okay? By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder. Again, now, this is Paul's idea of wisdom, which is not the Greek idea. It's not the Corinthian idea of wisdom. Okay, Paul says, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care. Okay, so you don't want, again, and this just makes sense, just in building. I am not a builder. I don't claim to be an expert on building, but it doesn't take it doesn't take a rocket science, but that's really mixing my metaphors there. How many of you would say hire a really expensive house builder, but you know what? I'm just going to let my brother-in-law pour the foundation. Clyde hasn't had work for quite some time, and he can go to Home Depot and buy and he'll mix it up he's got a stick. He'll do the foundation. It's just cement, but I'm going to pay $1 million to a home builder. How many of you would do that? Does that sound like a good idea? It's like, because if you pay the big good money for the foundation, you could hire a cheap builder and still, the house is going to fall down, and then you can continue building. But if you put the expensive house on a bad foundation, both are trash. Okay, so Paul says, listen, I laid the foundation. I put the foundation out there for you. Paul tells the believers in Corinth that they, plural, are that God's field, God's building. Paul continues with an analogy about building. Paul laid the foundation in Corinth. Someone else, Apollos perhaps, maybe he's referring to Apollos, is building on it. Although at this point, Apollos is almost certainly gone. Again. But in verse 11, and again, this is anyone not heard this verse before? For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. For no other foundation, for other foundation can no man lay but that which is laid, Christ Jesus. I think that's the King James version of it. So the foundation that Paul laid is the one that's already there. Okay, so Paul came in preaching the gospel of Christ, saying this is the cross, and which again is foolishness to the Greeks. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. Now, one of the ways that this passage goes sideways is people look at the building materials and say that certain things in the Christian life are gold and certain things are not. Okay, and this is one of those ideas. So Paul isn't necessarily saying that you can only use gold in building a church. Okay, whatever you do, don't use straw. Okay, there might be a part for using straw in building a house. I've seen like where you put it in like for insulation kind of thing. But I don't think that's the point. I think his point is just being careful in the building of the house. Okay, in the building of the church. And he's talking about the church. Okay, he's talking about concern for the church, not individuals. Okay, yes, it's true that on an individual basis that your life should have a foundation on Jesus. That's true, and you want to keep good stuff going in. Okay, but here Paul is talking to the church, that the foundation of the church should be Jesus Christ. Okay, and however you build it is important because it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. Okay. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. Now, obviously, wood, hay, what else are there? Wood, hay, or straw aren't going to last very long in a fire. So that is a consideration to say, okay, but it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing to do. It's just, okay, looking at your thing, is this going to last? Okay, so I mean, there are people that have taken all 6 of these and put like everything people do and say, well, that's hay, that's wood, that's straw. You know, it's like, okay, the point is, because gold isn't going to last very long in a fire either. So if you build your house made out of gold, gold isn't a very strong metal. It's valuable, but you don't build a house out of gold because it'll melt. Gold has a fairly low melting temperature. And if the fire comes out, what's going to happen to your solid gold house? It's going to melt. Okay, so this is why we don't want to get, because we think, oh, well, make your house out of gold. No, you don't want to do that. Okay, you don't want to do that. Okay, cast iron, much better. Steel, even better. Okay, but not gold. Silver is probably the same. Does anybody know silver have a low melting point as well? Higher than gold, but you still don't want to use, your cross beams made out of silver or gold. Okay, so again, it's costly stones, wood, hay, or straw. By the way, this is side thing. You know that the Bible never says that Jesus was a carpenter. Do you know that? I mean, the King James did, but the Greek word that is builder. The Greek word that teknon is builder, that when they describe Jesus, they describe him as a builder, not as a carpenter. And that's kind of interesting because if you're a carpenter, it means you work with, generally, wood. Now, if you go to Bethlehem, who's been to Bethlehem around here? Anyone been to Bethlehem? If you go to Bethlehem, if you go to Israel for that matter, not a lot of trees, okay? Not a lot of trees around. There is a lot of stone. If you go around Bethlehem, there's a lot of quarries. Okay, so it's far more likely that Jesus was like a stonemason than he was a carpenter. That's free. That won't be on your test. Just telling you. But when we went to Israel a few years ago, we were there in Bethlehem, and our guide Ray Vanderland is just pointing out. Do you see? I think he did. Do you see any trees? We're standing like at this quarry kind of thing. Do you see any trees? Well, if Jesus was a carpenter, where did he get his trees? Where did he get his wood? Kind of thing. But when the King James translators saw the word teknon, they immediately latched on the idea of a carpenter. And so that was how they translated it in 1611. And ever since that time, there's nothing wrong with saying Jesus is a carpenter. I mean, the Bible doesn't say he was a builder. Joseph was a builder, I should say. Isn't this Joseph the builder, or isn't this Jesus the builder's son? Would be the better translation. But be that as it may, I don't think he would have used gold or silver to build his house either. So it isn't, the point is not the material. The point is not to say, look at these materials and make sure you're using only gold, silver. The point here he's making is that as you are building your church, as you are creating the church body, putting it together, look for something that's going to last. Okay? Look for what's going to last. Paul is talking about the church, not individuals. Okay? The bottom line of 3:10 through 15 is that Paul cares about how churches are put together, how churches are built. Okay? And it's interesting, if we look at 1 Peter 5, I just wanted a couple of other, don't usually do this, but these came to mind. In 1 Peter 5, Peter is talking to the elders, and in the Baptist Church universe, the pastor is the elder of the church. You think, oh, who are the elders? Well, in the Baptist universe, the pastor is the elder. To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's suffering, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those who entrusted you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Okay, so this is like, hey, this is, okay, and I don't know where in there it says that you need to have like, your own airplane and your own kind of, I don't know where that is in there. But the other passage in Hebrews 13:17, 13 verse 17, have confidence in your leaders and submit to their authorities because they keep watch over you as those who must give an account. Okay, so it's like, so the leaders are going to be called in, what are they going to be called into account for at some point? It's like, well, when you were building the church, did you build it using ideas that were going to last? Did you focus it on the cross, or did you focus it on my technique versus Apollos' technique? Okay, which was it? Which did you do? Okay. Paul expands the analogy of building here, beginning in verse 16. Don't you know that you yourselves, again, now the way the NIV translates that, you yourselves, to make sure you know that we're talking about the plural here. So the King James, I think, is like, don't you know that you are the temple? And so we kind of go, oh, you. That's the trouble with English. We don't have a second person plural in English. Well, we do. It's you all. Except unless you're from Mississippi and somewhere in the area down there, you don't use the you all. Okay? That was the best thing about going to college in the South. I understood, okay, you all need to do this. You all, but here the NIV is trying to make it clear. You yourselves. He's talking to the church. Okay. Now in chapter 6, I'll just fast forward to this. In chapter 6, the word is singular. Don't you know you are the temple of the Holy Spirit kind of thing, which is in you, which you have of God. Okay. He's talking about the individual in chapter 6. But here he's talking to the church. He's talking to the body. He says, where am I? Oh, don't you know, just for the record, I did start in the right paragraph today, I'm just saying. I'm one week in a row starting on the right paragraph. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? Okay, now this is kind of an interesting point, and all I can do is, and I haven't developed this idea yet. Okay, so we know, slipping into our systematic theology, we know that we are indwelled by the Holy Spirit when we are believers. Okay, and so we have that, we have the presence of God within us, we have the mind of Christ. And yet there's another passage, and I forget where the writer says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I am, or something along that line. Okay, and so there's something, I don't know what, I haven't figured this out yet. I'm sure there's a YouTube video about it somewhere. But there's something about where 2 or 3 believers are gathered together, there's something different about that collection than being by yourself. I don't know what it is, just saying, and here is a similar concept. Okay? That God is dwelling in your midst, among you, not just a collection of, there's something special when believers get together. Okay? There's just something special about, there's something supernatural when believers get together. Okay? Maybe I'll develop that, try and develop that next week. Look for that YouTube video, the TikTok that's going to explain it to me. That's what I need. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. Did anybody remember back when we talked about Acts? When we were talking about Acts, we talked about Acts chapter 5. And in Acts chapter 5, you have the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And, here Ananias sees Barnabas get praise for giving land, giving all the land. And so Ananias and Sapphira come up with this, hey, I got an idea. Let's sell this land, and we'll give the money. And they sell the land for more than they thought. So they said, well, they're only expecting X amount of dollars. Let's just give X amount of dollars. And we'll get the same praise that Barnabas did. So they do that. And what happens?
It didn't work out.
Yeah, it didn't go out. It didn't go over too well. Okay, why? I mean, why? You think about it, why did that happen so early in the church's history? Okay, why was that necessary to do? I mean, because you think about it, it's like, well, I mean, did it really matter to, they still got the money, the church still got the money, why were they killed? Okay, and the point I made then was that God cares about the integrity in the church. That God was as serious about integrity with the New Testament church as he was with the Old Testament nation of Israel. Okay? And he wanted that example, and what happened after that? Great fear spread about it, which I think is, that's an interesting church growth technique. Do something that causes great fear. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing this afternoon. No, I'm sorry. But it's, you know, and here Paul is saying, you know, if you try to destroy this temple, this body, God is going to destroy you. All right? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. And the implication here, let me say, God expands the analogy of building by pointing out that the believers are God's temple. The Greek word, I forgot this point, the Greek word temple there is not the big temple area. It isn't like the building and the yards and the courtyard of the Gentiles and all. It isn't that. It's the intimate sanctuary. It's the Holy of Holies. It's the place where God dwells. That's the word that's translated temple there. Okay, it isn't like this big building. It's like this is you are the intimate sanctuary. You are now what the Holy of Holies was. That place where God dwells. Okay? And what happened if somebody in sin approached the Holy of Holies? You remember your Old Testament. That didn't go very well for them either. Okay, so that was a place where holiness was demanded, where God didn't take lightly to somebody with sin wandering into the Holy of Holies. He said, you try and destroy this temple, this body that I've created, and I'm going to take it very seriously. In fact, God is going to destroy that person. God's word, the Greek word suggests not the building, but the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. That's what H-O-H. And destroying this temple will bring God's judgment on the person that does that. And the implication here is that the Corinthian believers are doing just that, with the division and the quarreling and the jealousies that are happening. Okay. Now, I don't know what kind of judgments or things are going to happen at some point in the future, when we all get to heaven and the books are opened and another book is opened and we start having to explain all of the various church splits we've been a part of. See, I'm not looking forward to that more. Can we just skip over that part? But I think there is like, okay, wait a minute. So this was more important, kind of thing. But so Paul expands the analogy. I'm sorry, where am I here? Destroying the temple. The implication is that the Corinthian believers are doing just that. Do not deceive yourselves, verse 18. If any of you think you are wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. Okay, again, he's back to this point. He made it in chapter 1, verse 18. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Now here, I think this is directly at, because these are the Corinthian believers. Oh yeah, we've got this Sophia down, man. We know this approach to wisdom, and we have got it down. And Paul is saying, no, you don't. No, you don't. You don't have it down. Okay? You should become fools. Okay? You should become fools so that you may become wise. For the wisdom of the world is foolishness in God's sight. So Paul directly attacks the idea of human wisdom. To be truly wise, one must become foolish. Again, the wisdom of the world is foolishness in God's sight. We got this figured out. We have it, and again, there's all kinds of ways. I just kind of wonder about. I talked about Be Like Me books in here, right? Yeah. Did I talk about Be Like Me books? Somebody achieves a certain amount of success in the church universe, and that's actually across the globe. Any sort of organizational business. I first noticed it with business books. So they have a certain amount of success in their field, and so they decide that they need to write a book, a Be Like Me book. This is what I did. Do what I do, and you will be successful too. It'd Be Like Me book. And pastors write them all the time. Preachers, business leaders write them all the time. I think business leaders are more so than, I think the first Be Like Me book was Iacocca I ever read. Anybody read Iacocca? Does anybody remember Iacocca? Yeah. He was a guy that had worked for Ford for a number of years and was fired, and then went to work for Chrysler. And he was a big wheel at Ford. He was like the vice president of something or other. I mean, there were a lot of them. Their place was crawling with vice presidents. But when he was fired from Ford in that particular book, I remember thinking, he complains in the book about the fact that nobody would talk to him after being fired from Ford, and how cruel and heartless this was, and all these friends that he had established, and blah, 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 blah. Yet throughout the book, he'd never mentioned once reaching out to somebody he had fired, or that had been fired before he left Ford, where he went out of his way to do that. But now suddenly when it affects him, I'm like, oh, listen, Lee, you're a great guy. I appreciate the whole, wasn't he head of the Olympics or something? I forget. He headed up something. You're a great guy, but, ran for president, of course, because that's what you do. But yeah, it was a Be Like Me book. I'm going to edit that whole part out about Lee Iacocca, because, but again, these guys said, with all the Be Like Me books, and after a while they start to sound alike. Okay, I did this. I didn't think it would work, and then it did, and okay. I one time piled up, I can't remember why, but I have like a pile of books like about that big that are all, here's how to run a church, based on how we ran our church. We did our church, it works this way, so you do your church that way. And, some people have made a whole, Hybels has like 50, I think, books out. But Paul directly attacks the idea of human wisdom. For the wisdom of the world is foolishness in God's sight, as it is written. Now here he's quoting from Job. He catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise are futile. Okay, so this is not a new concept that Paul is introducing here, that the wise are futile. So then, so now let's bring it back to earth here. So then, no more boasting about human leaders. Quit getting hung up on whether you're from Paul or from Apollos or from Cephas/Peter. So then no more boasting about human leaders. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas. It doesn't matter who your leader was. Okay? All things are yours, or the world or life. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future. All are yours. All things are yours. Leaders. It's interesting. He says, so stop boasting about your leaders, because all things are yours. Leaders, world, life, death, present, future. These are all the things we have. We can boast in Christ, because all are yours, and you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. So what do we do with that? Where do we go with that? And that's where Paul leads into in chapter 4, which I'm going to get into next week. After having criticized stopping at chapters, that's exactly what I'm doing, stopping at a chapter. So do as I say, not as I do, which makes for great leadership. I don't know. What does Paul have to say about that? No, just kidding. Any questions? So again, Paul is the point Paul is making to the Corinthians is like, guys, you are hung up on the wrong things. You are hung up on the wrong things. You think what matters is whether you came to the church under Paul, or whether you came to the church under Apollos, or whether you came to the church under Peter. You think that's important, and it's not. And because you're focusing on the wrong thing, you're like way off what the right thing should be. Okay, so get over this. Forget about the fact that you're one of Paul's guys, and come back over here and say, listen, we're all one of Christ's guys. Because we have Christ, we have all of these things, but as long as you're hung up over here, you're never going to get to the right, on the right thing. And he's going to continue on talking about, so again, chapter 4, verse 1. This then is how you ought to regard us. And now he's going to kind of put the corrective out next week. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
Wouldn't it be be in the early church, isn't it easy to see how they would get off the track so much? Because there's not sort of an institution or establishment, and so Paul comes and does his thing, and then he has to go, and then somebody else comes and does his thing. I mean, I'm just trying to cut him some slack, that they get confused, and who has the final word, and how do they do that? I mean, isn't that part of the struggle of getting the church going?
Yes, and I think that's kind of the point Paul is making, that well, and it's natural for people to do that. When we think again, and we'll see it again when the new pastor is installed. We'll see that people will suddenly go, well, that's not how Pastor Don or Pastor Dennis did it, and suddenly you'll have that, and people will leave. People will leave because, I'm just hanging around to see who the new pastor is. I mean, if you could take a poll and ask that question and people would answer it honestly, there are quite a few people in the church who I'm just hanging around to see who the new pastor is. And if I approve of him, then I'll stay.
And there are people who are left who are waiting to see who the new pastor is.
And there are people that might come back. It says all of a sudden you'll see people go, hey, I haven't seen you for a few years. And I heard there's a new pastor. Kind of under new management, sort of the sign of, maybe that'll be the first, for the installation service, under new management. Wish I knew somebody in the leadership group. I'd throw that suggestion out and say, hey, guys, this is what we should do under new management. But yeah, I think it is. There is a human tendency, and but I think Paul is annoyed with this. I don't think Paul is happy. But we were talking about this. Paul, one of the I don't think Paul sat down and wrote his epistles like we write a college thesis or a college dissertation paper. Debbie and I are wrestling through the beginning stages of this process, and it's like, kind of creating. You have to come up with a dissertation. And then in order to have your dissertation, you have to create a theoretical framework for your dissertation. And I'm like, what's that? What's a theoretical framework? And so she and I are kind of going back and forth. Do you think this is it? No, I don't think that. I don't know what it is. And so and I'm like, this is how I'm going to explain it. So I read it to her. This is what I'm going to say, And so, because you have to be very, very careful. And there's a certain structure in it because you make your point. It's very. I don't think Paul went to that much effort. And that doesn't mean it's not the texts aren't inspired, but I think Paul is just out. He's going, you guys are not. I thought I made it clear. You ever had that conversation with your kids? Do this way, and they did it that way, and you come back to them and you say, why didn't you do it this way? Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to. I'm teaching ninth graders, and that's like an everyday conversation kind of thing. I explicitly told you this was going to happen. How did you get that question wrong? I could stand up in front of my ninth grade class. I swear I could do this on a day of a test and say, the answer to question number 4 is letter B. Okay, letter B. Question number 4, the answer is B. A good number of students will get question number 4 wrong. Maybe because they don't trust me. I think he's lying. I think it's one of those, kind of stuff. Maybe that is. I'll give them credit there, perhaps. But it's like, you just say the attention to detail at the ninth grade level. I was telling Debbie on the way in, a kid came in, African-American student came in wearing a Beatles sweatshirt the other day. Thursday or Friday. And my rule of thumb, if a kid comes in wearing a shirt of a group, any kind of a musical group, I say, name 3 songs by that particular performer. And so I said to the kid, can you name 3 Beatles songs? Huh? Beatles. The Beatles. Yeah? You're wearing a Beatles shirt. He goes, oh, is this a Beatles shirt? I say, yeah, it says the Beatles across the front of it. Oh, I didn't notice. Okay. Name 3 Beatles songs. There's 2 of them. Like it's got the Beatles, and then it's got, you know, I know you all are, none of you guys know this stuff, but, you know, those of us in the world, you know, has like Help, like you know, this, you know, like the lights coming out and Help, and then Love Me Do. These are 2 Beatles songs. I'm told, Debbie told me this. I personally wouldn't know this. I get this from Debbie. But if any of you know Debbie, you know that's not true. Okay, well, there's 2 of them written on the shirt. And he looks down and goes, the Beatles? No, that's the name of the group. That's not a song. You know? I'm like, okay. And I told him, I said, well, you know, if I show, I'm going to edit this whole part out. Now, if I showed up with a Ludacris shirt on, you know, old white guy with a Ludacris shirt on, you'd be like, hey, what is, you know, why can't I do the same thing if you're wearing a Beatles shirt? And just go sit down. Just don't worry about it. So, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.